my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. In this video, we're looking at Dune 3.5. Now, firstly, apologies if I seem a little tired or washed out. Last night was the big, very big launch for the Naked Head album that I mixed and did a lot of work with. So it was a little bit of a late one, but the great news was that it went over extremely well. Not just blowing my trumpet, but reminding people that this is actually what I do. I'm not a YouTuber. I'm actually a real living mix engineer. And for some sense of reference, Jake, who is the main music man in that situation, finished the show last night. He would have got home about 1 o'clock, I think, and very early this morning he was off on the next leg of the Wiggles tour. So yeah, not just some other guy making stuff up. Now, speaking of making stuff up, we're looking at Dune, as I said. Initially, or one of the things on the list, and the reason I ended up at Dune was because I was asked to look at Sylenth. Sylenth's been around like a million years. I remember it first coming out, and then the controversy that apparently some of it was put together in synth edit. How dare you? And it was all very childish because it was a good instrument. I never got into it, but it was a good instrument. And then it foundered. Nothing ever really went beyond there. And I always kind of wondered, well, what happened? They had one of the biggest name synths out there, and we never heard a thing. And whilst I was looking at it, I'm going, you know what, this reminds me a lot of something. The first thing actually was the sound, and I'm thinking, you know what, this reminds me of Antidote, which is Synapse. Synapse? Dunno. But I'm wondering, see, made up, that if the fellow behind Sylenth wasn't actually ported over to Synapse. Synapse did change direction. They had a fairly early studio environment, which was kind of cool, but it was never going to make it past that level without some big changes, and I guess they realised it wasn't where they were going and focused more on the synth thing, which happens to pick up really from where Sylenth had kind of left off. Antidote was put out for a reason, and it has that same sound. And then Dune appeared, and it's that sound. And it's been very, very successful. I don't run it, I never have. There are a couple little things that just put me off, but that's probably more a personal thing, and then I have other go-tos, but there is a lot to recommend in this instrument. We might as well start by having a look at some of the presets. They are all here and all organized in various sorts of ways. Like most of these things, they are prone to being a little loud and possibly a little over-affected. But it is that sound. No doubt, if you listen to this kind of music, you've probably heard presets like this, variations of all over stuff. I assume that there is a much larger database than this. There are quite a lot of sound libraries out there. Nice. It is very nice for pads. Oh, that's Bellatrix. There's a lot of ability for life and movement. A pair of arpeggiators on board. And you can get a little heavy-handed. It does take a little bit of getting used to in the programming, but there is a large amount of patches if you want to be a patch hand. Again, just watch your levels. You don't want to start a mix with your first sound already being sort of up there at 0 dB, because you're then going to be trying to force up and up and up. So, you know, if I bring this in, where am I looking at? It's okay, but that's too high, so I would be pulling some back. You haven't got a lot of throw on this knob, so I would be probably using the gains at the top of my mixing board. If you have a mixing board that doesn't have gains at the top, I feel for you, but then just insert, probably just here underneath your instrument, some kind of gain type plugin that just allows you to shed 6, 12 dB or whatever it takes to get it into a mixable level. Also consider very carefully how much of these effects you need on board. The effects I actually really like here. Unfortunately, there's no master switch, but do look at backing them down a bit. Because while they sound fantabulous here, once you get into a mix, it is entirely possible. I guess that's your master switch there. I guess. It's a little more complex than that at times. But just be cautious, because if somebody sends me a sound with that much reverb and they've otherwise got a fairly mobile mix, because it's bouncy, what have you, then that could be a problem, and you can't get rid of it once it's there. So I'm either going to have to go back and say, hey, can you turn all those things down or off, or I'm going to do a mix that doesn't work as well because they're going to overpower what's going on, and you'll also struggle to make your sounds fit together because you've got so much processing here, like so much effect that creates that sort of like, oh, it's an amazing world. But then the other sounds that you've got have got equally as large an amount of effects. They'll all be like in 14 different worlds, and you'll struggle to bring them into one world without making, well, mud soup. So that's a standard problem with most synths with presets, because presets are designed to sound impressive, not necessarily to work in your mix, because when you make presets that are going to work in a mix and be versatile, people go, oh, but that's not very impressive, man. It's like, yeah, I can't have both. So very impressive in terms of presets and availability and extra packs that you can purchase for, I think, reasonable prices. Synapse themselves, as I said, have been around for a very long time. They are one of the earlier players and one of the longer players, and yet have not ever ended up in a position where they're kind of like industry name, even though Dune is a name that is quite commonly bandied around. Version 3, 3.4, 3.5 have added various things. I'm not really looking at the difference from one version to another, but they have improved and done more with the oscillators, which I am glad to see, because at times I have felt that despite there being a lot of synth, in certain ways there is a lot of lack of synth as well. I think their architecture is not all it coulda, shoulda, and this does improve that quite markedly. The effects, normally I am the first to disparage effects on board, but Synapse does a good job, and they do integrate the idea of sound and effect in a pretty good way. I have my annoyances with it, but so long as you're not overdoing the effect, you know, before you're getting it to the mix, there's a lot of positive to be said about what's on board. The company's been around. They still seem to have a slightly limited spread of product, but you don't really hear any bad words about them. So whoever they are, whatever they've done, whether they are or aren't the silent people, doesn't rightly matter. it's a solid enough company that don't seem to oversell themselves, gild their lily. The product speaks for itself, and it speaks well. In terms of pricing, this is up there in the monster or uber synth department. It's not the most expensive, it's not the cheapest, but it is highly capable. So at $179, $180, it is very fairly priced. Saying, oh, but I don't want to spend that kind of money, and yet still expect the same sort of results from freeware, or worse, going out and cracking, as in stealing. The moment you start down that path, just don't try to justify it, because that's the quickest way to hell. But to say to yourself, how would I feel if I got home and discovered someone had taken my television because they couldn't be bothered to pay for their own? You'd probably be finding your baseball bat, and that's right. $180 for what you get if you're going to use it is very, very fair. If you don't want to spend the money, then look at either Vital, even though I'm not such a big fan of it, or if you're going to use it properly, like, get in there and learn to synthesize Surge, because it's awesome. But if you prefer Vital, go for Vital. But there is there's a difference between the two. Personally, I probably would still prefer Surge, but that's a personal thing. There's something in the sound of Dune which gives it that sound immediately, which is great for many, many people. It's slightly not quite where I want to be personally, but 180, very, very fair. There are upgrade options if you're already on the Dune thing, but we're assuming you're not. And then there are these sound sets, which are generally in the $20 to $40 arena. Obviously check them out. I haven't looked at them, but there's a lot of capability for a sound designer. There's a lot of capability in here. Take a while to get yourself there, but it's worth it. So we'll go through the good and bad and then start to look in a little bit more detail at Dune. It's alliterating. Well, obviously that winning sound, that can be a slight problem if you're trying to break outside of that sound, but there is nothing to stop you from creating your own sound, your own feel from Dune. It's not a one-trick pony. It's not sort of stuck in that groove of only ever sounding like that. Yes, most of the patches tend to sound like that, but it's just because they're trying to make you go, ooh, it's so that sound. The unison and layering. Initially, I just had unison and then swarm, which we'll look at a little bit later, as being real positives. And then I realized that unison was not quite as odd as it seemed, that it's actually a layering system as well. So you can run it as basically one synth with up to 8 clones of itself, or you can run it as up to 8 synths. Yep, that's 8. All in one go. And it took me a while, but I keep looking at this thing going, why is that so strangely laid out? And then it dawns on me, hang on. The effects, as I said, the exclamation point is here because normally I'm the one turn them off. But the effects here, as I said, are actually a positive part of the experience more than not. The negatives, well, the big one for me is that focus can be lost fairly easily. And by that, I mean that when you go to do one thing, sometimes you can have to do 2 or 3 things, when to me it would be far more elegant to pare that down to maybe one thing. Example, oscillator. Let's just make sure that we've got an initialized patch to start with. Don't want anything. If I've got my sound and I say, okay, what's happening with oscillator 2? Nothing's happening with oscillator 2. How do I turn oscillator 2 on? Oh, well, then I have to go up here and move to oscillator 2. And then I have to go, oh, I better add some oscillators. Would it not have been perhaps more elegant? I can understand with space considerations, you're going to do this sort of flip from one thing to another. It's VST thinking. But wouldn't it been a lot more elegant to just have an on-off button. There is space to do it, either by using space under here or using the titling, anything. So that way you leave this so that it's going to make noise when it's turned on. To leave it that you can turn it on and then you have to turn it on again. So it feels like, as I say, 3 actions to be able to do one thing. So that, to me, personally, I find a bit of a killer. I find it cumbersome at times and I've had the same problem with Antidote. That's part of why I don't use it. I find it cumbersome for some reason. When I force myself to use it, it goes to mix. But I have to force myself to use it. So make sure that you're comfortable with the workflow and that it goes with you. Otherwise, if you like the sound and you like what you can do with it, you're just going to have to get used to that it's a little, you've got to work its way. The other one is that I couldn't get the MSEG to be bipolar, meaning as in there's an up and a down. So an LFO normally goes up and down around the parameter. The MSEGs all just seem hard-coded to being unipolar. And at a synth of this level, I kind of wonder, why don't we have an option? Maybe I'm just spoilt with Europa, because Europa is easier to see what's going on most of the time, and little things like that. But there are things that this does that Europa doesn't do, or you would have to do a different way, and Europa has a different sound, but Europa has a very, very brutally flat sound, whereas this, I believe, probably has some kind of EQing and saturation going on to make it all kinds of. Neither of those negatives are killer in the sense of saying this sucks, it does not suck, but if, like me, you find them counterproductive in the workflow, you're going to have to make your peace with them one way or another. So the focus thing is really the one that bugs me every time I use it. It's like, and that's been from the earliest times of demoing it. It's just like, oh, that's annoying. But there's an awful lot more in the synth now than there was, so it's getting to the point probably where if I wanted what it did and didn't have a better way of doing it, or another way of doing it, an equal way of doing it, then it would probably be enough to just go, yeah, whatever, it's just a quirk of the beast. Right, let's start to have a look at some of the features. We can fold that up, get that out of our way. We've seen that there are patches and sandbanks and all that kind of stuff. There's then this patch menu, allows us to load patches and copy effects from one place to another, revert a patch, I assume that's to whatever it was before, and the most important, initialize patch. Took me a while to find it, but it is there and it is going to do the job. There's the option for multi-threading or not multi-threading. I find that with leaning on the keyboard with lots and lots of things running at once, multi-threading one hands down. There are various skins, color versions and what have you. You can play with those. I didn't really meddle with the rest of this at all. It is limited to 4 voices initially, but you can raise that on up, to borrow from Alan Jackson. All absolutely fine stuff. There are some settings, again, really didn't meddle with those. One of the things in terms of the focus argument was that I learnt that as soon as I realize I'm actually programming a sound, I need to move to mod matrix. Otherwise it would annoy me. The fact that it's not visible all the time just annoys me. I'm so used to it being visible all the time on Thor or Europa and the like. This one that it's hidden, especially under less important settings, I can understand they think that most people don't want to see it because they're freaked out by it, but if you're going to use the synth, then my advice is as soon as you realize you're getting into programming, click yourself onto the mod matrix. There are 32 slots, which should be enough. We'll look at that a little bit. Actually, no, we will cover that now. So you choose a source. It's a little limited in sources and destinations. It's not as, like, you can't really cross from one oscillator to another, but you can apply a source to a destination. So we can use a drop down to find a destination, or we can use this thingy to go from here and drag to where we want to go. Everything that's a target or a possible target is lit up. When we hover over it, it makes itself apparent. So we could... The modulation is not at all difficult. There is some kind of voicing thing. I think that's how you apply to various voices. I'm not going to get into that. We'll look a little bit at how the voicing layering system works. By the time you get to there, you know, you're going to want to work it out. Most things, double click will reset them. That covers most of the housekeepy type stuff. Now we have 3 oscillator banks. 1 and 2 are the same as each other. 3 is a cut down. It's interesting, funny, it was like, why don't you make all 3 the same? But it seems to be the fashion. It's the same with pigments. You know, like you give 2 oscillators and then some kind of a utility oscillator. I just think, why don't you give all 3 capable of the same stuff? It's more powerful, you've got the code, but whatever. So 1 has the option, or 1 and 2 have the option of being VA, virtual analog, so your standard forms. It's only a one-way pulse width, but there's no particular need for a pulse width to be two-way in any practical sort of sense. Doesn't go as, even though it says 100%, that's not 100%. 100% is nothing. The knob goes to 100%, but it really only goes to 97 or something or other. So it's mislabeling, boys, mislabeling. I mean, you've gone to the trouble of putting 50% here, but 100% is nothing. The sound actually slips out of existence because it's too thin to do anything. So just being pedantic, but I do like me a pulse wave that will go to nothing. There's a certain charm, especially when doing ultravox sounds. There is also an oscillator sync, and initially this is confusing. These aren't tied together. They've used lines to tie these together, but they don't use lines to tie these together, so we assume that this and this belong to each other. No, they don't. This and this belong to each other, but don't belong to that as directly. So you can put it into a sync, and that's your secondary oscillator frequency here. You get used to that. That's your main bass synth kind of thing. You then got the, let's everyone get it very excited, up to 32, which is a pretty stupid number. Stupidly large. Good on them. Now, while that is stupidly large, there's a certain kind of sound that you can get from that. So the fact that they have offered the stupid options, not only in the number of voices runnable at once, but in how far they can detune, I actually think is a positive. They've said, okay, not only can it do the detune politely, but we're going to let you do the detune stupidly as well. Equally, we can come over here. That's going to be useful when we have storms of bees, no doubt. There are various modes, didn't really go through them except for this fine fellow here. We might just reduce our count a tiny bit so that this seems a little bit more sane. Linear. Swarm. What that's doing is doable in some other places, but this is built into the module and it is rather cool. You must have more than one voice going. The swarm does nothing at one voice. I would like to see it still do its magic at one voice, because guess what? That's analogy. So why deprive us of that until we've got 2 or more? But here, how even with 2, they're moving against each other. So the swarm has something that moves them around. Not for every situation, but if you are looking for a more old school kind of sound, Jupiter 4 or whatever, I don't know how wondery they were, but the swarm mode, even with 2, will give you that kind of analog-y type movement, which oddly enough is not default in the synth. There's no sort of drift knob. So this is as close as you get to a drift knob without programming something into the matrix using an LFO or MSEG or whatever. Probably needs to be an LFO. So it's kind of a cool thing to have there. It's a newish addition, and in the right situation, quite useful. We then have the wavetable option. We will pull that back to just the one. And the wavetable gives you some bass waveforms there, but then you've got your other options. And this shows you what's in each of the slots. Wavetable, contrary to the kind of modern popular thinking of it being some kind of sample, which it can be, is really X number of slots with a different waveform in each slot, and then the ability to either crunch from one to another or to smoothly morph from one to another. So we see with the default here, we've got these three waveforms which are somewhat different from one another, and we can smoothly morph or interpolate to some amount or not. It's also possible to make them one shot. I honestly didn't spend time looking at that. Generally with these sorts of things you want them to be moving, but from time to time if you've got a very specific designed wavetable, let's say it's a piano, so the beginning of the table, like slot 1 is the beginning of the piano hit, and slot 8 is the sustain after all the excitement's been done, then you only want that to shoot once. You don't want that to keep looping over, because otherwise it's like pang, 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 pang. That's not the sound you're looking for. So if you are finding that it's looping, then put it into a one-shot mode. But you may find that that gets a little blip if it's not designed as a longer thing. This is kind of cool. There's a certain amount of stuff here. Mostly people these days seem to use these as a basis for doing wacka wacka paint stripper type stuff, but they're also very versatile in pad work by having subtle movement in one or more sound inside the pad. There is then, and this apparently is relatively new, this edit mode, which is pretty darn good. You can click on any of your slots and you can go through layering in or adding in particular things. Like I can just turn that to a sine wave, so your basic forms you can access here. And then there was other stuff about how you're handling what you're doing with the things. You can import waves and what have you. To be perfectly honest, I didn't, but I can't see why it wouldn't work at all. You can also export wavetables either directly to come back into Dune, or you can create a wavetable and export it as a WAV file and load it into Europa, Serum, whatever your poison is. Various other little housekeeping things that we can do, adding, subtracting, what have you, from the whole process. And then it's a case of editing, so we can draw our form by hand, and that's going to sound wonderful. Notice when we click on one of these, it puts it into audition mode. Nicely thought through. I don't have to go back and go, oh, I need to turn the knob to where I'd be hearing this. It automatically goes into an audition mode. And I think it may drop the level as well, I'm not sure, but it's not an intrusive audition mode, which is cool. So I can edit that way. This one I didn't work out what to do with. No doubt if I read the manual, but remember that's not part of the brief here. You can draw lines. And that's obviously going to let you be a little bit more accurate. I could normalize that. There's another one which lets you do these curve type things, and then you can, I think it's apply it or clear it out or whatever. It's one of those ones you're going to need to take a little bit of time just to get used to what your options are. And then you've got a mode where you can, let's just swap this to a sine wave, where you can actually do direct operation on the partial. So this is additive synthesis at, well, the beginning of the additive synthesis approach. I think I must have a filter closed on the outside. So while not a full additive synthesizer in the hardcore kind of a form, it's allowing you to create different waveforms for each part of the slots. Let's just pull this back to only a pair of them. So we've got one there, which is going to be wiggity wiggity wave, and this one, which will be, actually no, we won't do that. It'll be kind of not the right tone. We'll do that. So we go back to where we were. Yes, the filter's closed. Nice, nice. I liked what was in Hallion better, but it was far more hardcore, at a more hardcore price as well. This gives you a fair amount of flexibility, and I didn't at any point feel that it was unduly clunky. So kudos to what they've got here. Oh, there was a way to type in math formula, but less said about that, the better. So that's your wavetable form, and there's then an FM form. I think this is fairly new. You've only got two algorithms for how the operators operate upon each other. If you want to understand more about operating upon each other, there should be an algorithm. Well, there's the Dext review, which is out, and there should also be the algorithm one, which is out sooner, which is an easier way to comprehend the FM thing. But basically, you've got two forms. So A operates on B, which operates on C. So all about level. So nothing, sine wave. These don't have envelopes to control over time, so that's just where you're going to need to call in, and let's say an MSEG, double click to give me a dot, double click to give me another dot. Let's choose our MSEG 1. You've got to get it right. I spent some time thinking this doesn't work because I had the wrong thing. I can at least drag and drop there. Remember, these are always positive. Sure where that's blowing, but some of these sorts of digital waves can be incredibly loud. So it requires a little bit of thought sometimes to work out how to get a little bit more movement than just a static tone. Same can be done obviously with this one. Simple, limited, but in its own limited way, kind of versatile. The layout makes the most of what they've got without getting overly complex. You'll get used to how it works, and I think sort of, again, kind of kudos for achieving a pretty good outcome with not a lot to work with. So that is cool. You've got 3 tone engines there. You've got the same 3 tone engines here, and then you've got the ability to either have a waveform or to load a waveform. This one will work. A lot of those are wavetable-y type things. Now, this is the annoying thing. It's like, oh, I've got to now raise oscillator 3, and I can't, apart from seeing this, I can't see. It's like, what? Draw me a picture of the waveform. You got the technology in here to do it, or just put a big S in there to tell me that I'm using a sample. It's just little things like that make a difference. So I've pulled in that's number 1. So that ability to load samples, you can view your sample and then get into to loop and what have you. Not the most full-on sample, slicey-wicey kind of a situation, but it's not meant to be. It's an extra thing that you can add. I really quite liked that. Actually, whilst I'm here, let's go to number 2. Get these out of the way. See what I mean? It's just like there's a certain amount of messing around involved here. Go to wavetable. No. How does one load one's own? Menu, import, wave. See what happens. Now I know I've designed that as a wavetable. All right, I hear something. So that was easy enough. I don't know that it sounds quite right, but I can't remember that one as well. So fit to wavetable, let's go with, oh, that was the one that I chose. Then that's not come out right. So either I'm doing something wrong or it's not coming through right. Maybe let's try this again. Import. That's come out differently. Again, that's not right. Don't know what I'm doing wrong there. I won't sort of cast any particular judgments or aspersions in that situation. We have a result, and it's kind of interesting. It's just not the sound that I made. That was making some wavetable sounds for Europa, and they import there perfectly. But that's made in Reason, exported via Reason, imported via Reason. So you would expect it to work perfectly. There may be some little rule that I've upset here. That's our oscillators. Oh, and there is a noise source here as well. Oh, the ability to ring mod. I think it's probably oscillator 1 and 2 together. I don't love it, but maybe I just haven't found the right situation. But you can fly in a little bit of noise, high pass, low pass, and you can make the noise go out there as well. Be careful with doing that. While it will sound impressive, it can mess up your stereo field terribly. But if you're using Unison type stuff, note Unison is not available in operator or slot 3. But if we are unisonifying here, that should be handling our stereo. But if we don't want the rest to be any more stereo, we can throw our noise out there. It's one to take with care, but it is nice to see it there. It's an unexpected knob, and I think in its own way a pretty cool knob. So we're getting nice sounds here, and that's really what it's all about. Then we've got this filter. Filter now has a lot of forms. It didn't have so many forms at the beginning, but now it's got a lot of forms. Generally, people really, really like the Synapse filters. They tend to have a certain sound to them. It's that's the right VA kind of sound. Does it make them bad filters? No, not at all. It gives people the sound that they're looking for. But just be aware, it's not the only sound, and at times that does put me off a synth that has that sound and that sound alone. But for many people, they're looking for that sound to be right from the beginning. And this definitely gives you that in spades. A lot of options. Some of these are really nice. You You won't hear a huge difference one to another. It's more when they're really in action. As you move from form to form, you may well need to move the cutoff because I guess they're emulating how that feels in real life with regards to its knobs, positioning, and what have you as well. TR, I take them to be, well, yes, transistor, so that's TB303, which is a 24, not an 18, as people will try to cluelessly tell you. You know, that's a transistor. They're a diode. So who's a transistor ladder? That's probably Moog. That's probably meant to be Moog. Acid low pass will be the diode, which is a nasty cheap sound. But if you're after that god awful 303 sound, which has its charms, then the acid low pass. I knew it was there somewhere. Salon keys are the MS-20. They're a low cut rate, a low number of poles, but as you raise the resonance, they don't lose any bass. They're an equal level, which means that they can and will distort. They have their charms, not always what you want. And then there's the old Dune, which in comparison now to one of these is a little flat. But they are all good filters. There's a second set. I did not fully get my head around this, how this works. There's a set of routings and what have you, but I didn't work it out. Again, deliberately not reading the manuals. You can link so that they work in tandem with each other. All cool. I just couldn't easily work out how to, have this do this and then put in, say, a band pass and have it sounding like okay, now it's working. But it's if it's all over, then you're only hearing this one. In the middle, you need to obviously have the right settings, and then it's one filter into another. It just doesn't feel, again, to be the easiest, most intuitive way of doing it. Plus, what I noticed, and one of those things where I feel like you're missing a little on the architecture, is that we can't choose which filter we send one of these to. There is a workaround and another solution, which I found later, but if I hadn't found that, it would have been a genuine criticism. But there's ability to run a couple of filters, one into the other. And that's really rather cool. Modulation, well, we've kind of really covered that already, but we will have a look down here. You've got all these different tabs and stuff. VST so love its tabs. We've got an effects bus 1 and an effects bus 2. And initially you might think, geez, that's overkill. But because we've got to this layering later, then it starts to make a lot of sense. But there's a heavy commitment to effects, and the effects are nicely made. There are 3 LFOs. So if we've set ourselves up an LFO, again, this is just showing the routing. You've got to choose your source by hand. And then if we decide where we want that to go, let's say I want that to go to number 3. So I assume, no, that's not the one I wanted. Let's go to fine. So we can set an amount there. Rate, if that's a bit much. And the offset will move, though it doesn't show us, but it will move the center around which it operates. See, so like they have the technology here for changing polarity actually in a knob situation, so slidey rather than a AB, and yet it wasn't applied on the MSEGs, or at least I didn't find it. So modulation works easily. 3 LFOs is probably okay. I look at it and I sort of think, gee, why haven't we got 4? But 3 LFOs is pretty normal in the situation, so more is better, but can't bitch. And most decent DAWs these days are developing or have developed a pretty workable modular situation. If you are of that bent that you want more and more CV type control, modulation, make things wibble around, then you probably already got, or looking at Reason or Bitwig is a real serious player in that. I think there's a system in Ableton, but I don't open Ableton. And then we have these MSEGs we've seen in action already. There's quite a bit you can do with them, but remember they seem to be tied to only operating as envelopes rather than doubling as LFOs. There is nothing to stop you from assigning them to work as LFOs. So let's take MSEG 2 and assign that to, what shall we assign that to? Let's assign that to this one, so to number 2, and something a little bit excitable. Oh. Yeah, we'll go with position, see what we get. Do something MSEGy so that we feel seggy with our M's. We can see there's movement. Wavetable 2, position 100. See, this is where I get like, okay, why am I not seeing or hearing what I expect? Let's have a look at this. MSEG 2, that's MSEG 2. It's assigned. Don't know. And I had this a couple of times and couldn't work out what was wrong. One time it was because I was operating, like using completely the wrong MSEG. The first one is working correctly. This one... unclear. Let's try number 1. Maybe number 2 just... Okay, it's operating. So what's happening with Oscillator 2? Maybe it's just not... Oh, I remember why, because it's... turns out to be incredibly not loud. So... let's bring in something that's actually going to do something and apply this to position. So it's not dropping down. Normally on a synth with an LFO or something, you'd have set your knob to the center position where you want your modulation to move around. But in this situation, I'd have to assign it to the lowest position that I want it to be. And we can hear all that movement happening. So let's... cool. It is doing what it's meant to do. And even though it doesn't sound great on its own, that little bit of movement is working nicely. So what have we got next to look at? Well, obviously we are going to get to effects. Effect bus 1. We have a distortion unit, which maybe just running too loud. A master level would be kind of nice, either before filters, or with extra effects in here, you can work them out, or before. It's, even at nothing, it's just going straight into Black Sabbath. Could we not be a little softer? Saturation is, you can hear it. It's in splaturation before we got anywhere, and before you said, yeah, we'll just use the wet dry knob. You could use the wet dry knob, but remember, I'm not a wet dry knob kind of a guy. So the distortions are probably pretty good if you're looking to get distorty, but if you're looking for milder saturation or what have you, at least I'm not getting it. And there isn't an easy way that I can see to reduce, I guess maybe here. Okay, fair enough, maybe there. And then you've got to pump your level there. Again, that's kind of one of those, I have to think about it and do three things to do one thing. If you know that these are hot, you've got space to, all of this space, you've got all that space to give a trim on the beginning, which would have been useful rather than forcing me to rearrange this and this and this to get what I want. That's just one of those things that's like, we have these EQs. I do find that having to turn them on and off, while it makes perfect sense, I find, again, that's another one of those little... I'm always suspicious that synths like this already have an EQ curve built into them. As I indicated earlier, I'm suspicious that there's saturation already happening. Fair enough. Mini-Moogs are renowned for how splatty they are. But I also think that there is probably some sort of an EQ curve, whether that's some sort of sliding situation, AI, or whether they've simply sort of said most people don't want to hear certain kind of frequency and it's dropped at. There is just noticeably something unflat about this. It's flattering, but not flat. Fair enough, that's the sound of the instrument. I guess if you want to find whatever that is and put that sound back in, then you can. In theory, it should be the same. I'm a little bit more of the tell it to me straight, doctor, and then we work out what to do with it. But you've got various nodes and options to do EQ-y stuff with, and they sound good. So no argument from me on them. You can go again if that wasn't enough, but wait, we can drag that around. So we could EQ pre-drive, and no, we can change the sizes, but I don't seem to be able to copy a particular effect to another slot. Maybe I can, maybe I just haven't seen it. I think you can copy a whole bus from one to another, but we could then go and do the opposite here. So that's like finding that and chopping a bit of it out and de-emphasizing that, and there's a little bump there. So let's assume that they are the opposite of each other. So you can emphasize what you want to distort or compress and de-emphasize on the other side, should you so desire. Nothing against the distortion models, just far too aggressive for my idea of fun. There is a phaser. Not my favorite phaser, but it does sound nice and will be useful more often than not, where I have used antidote into mixes, especially sort of gone, okay, well, it wants to do that sound, and done the jarre sort of sound. Their phaser is pretty spot on for that. Chorus actually turns out to be nice, easily overdone. So once the chorus is in, it can be tending to be a bit much and just make everything sound the same. Doesn't matter what changes you make, you're just hearing that chorus. Fair enough. Just learn to pull it back a little bit. Then we've got delays. We've got a pair of these little fellas. They default to syncing. I had no clear sense of how the low and high cut worked at all. I think they were kind of strange. They seem to have been oddly done. Why not just leave them like that at default and then let us close them up? That would make sense. But there's low and high cut that I don't know. I don't feel like I can hear what they're doing as well. You can narrow down the width, which of course I approve of because I tend to pull those things into my own. And it is modulatable. Thank you. Oh, these work backwards. Why work backwards? What possesses you to think that it makes sense to work backwards? That's short, that's long, but no, that's short and that's long. No wonder I found their delay a little obtuse and hard to get the result that I'm looking for, because it works backwards. Why do that? It just makes no sense. I can understand doing that if you were cloning a particular piece of equipment that was renowned for having all its knobs backwards, which some did back in, I don't know, the 40s. There was probably some reason why it made sense. But on a modern instrument, why go to the trouble of making something obtuse when it doesn't need to be? Anyway, there's a pair of delays, and then this reverb, which is that reverb. It's that sound again, that. Okay, low cut's getting rid of the low. High frequency damp, no high cut, but that's fair enough. Oh, there's a sync button on it as well. But you can't really say there's anything wrong with the reverb, just don't overdo it. Because remember, from here, we should be pushing that into the room that is the environment for the piece. So keep it a little controlled. There is then this compressor, which seems very eager to be compressing things, I gotta say. We can pull back, but it's kind of hell-bent on compressing. Again, your threshold is actually backwards from the standard. So you turn it down to get less, which sort of makes sense, but every other compressor works that you're lowering the point at which things start to happen. Whatever. Attack. It's pretty fast regardless. Release, and then you can finesse your output. And parallel, if you feel like you're a parallel kind of a person. And again, we can rearrange where things are in the process. One thing I do miss is a master button, but I have found it up here. But understand that gets a little bit more complex later, potentially. So a very nice sound engine when you accept what it is and therefore is not going to do. Then we have got, oh, there's arpeggiators. That's enough of that. We then got this thing. We've got that, oh, we've been in a detune mode for a while. 100 sounds a bit much. Don't fall for detune always being better, you know. That's always going to sound nicer on solo, but then you end up with a mix full of sounds where every single sound is too big. Again, that is like trying to get all the sumo wrestlers for your match through one small door at once, rather than organising to have them walk through one at a time, trying to jam them through all at once by making every single sound like stupid big. Sounds great in solo, bound to fail later. Now, that's your straight being able to do the detune unison thing. There is then this strange voices out mode. And initially it just like, what is this about? But there's then a double duty for this, which is really not indicated on the panel. If we put this to 2, that's 1, and then we can move from one to another. And this is where I get confused. And how do we do this? I'm not seeing it. And I worked it out yesterday, and it's like, oh, okay, that is cool. We can listen to voice 1 and 2 in solo. There are 2 voices, so we can listen to 1 or 2. But then we can put this into a mode where we should be able to click this and then see the same synth again. There's no real way of telling us. I just noticed, hang on, they're all in different like instances, different iterations of the instrument. I don't think I'm going to be able to show you, and that is part of my frustration on this. As I say, you often have to work things out more than you should, but there is a way to get this to, apparently, and then yesterday I had it running with 2 separate synths. You know, the voice 1 was set up as one synth, voice 2 was set up as a completely different synth, so it was like make a whole new patch. You have to put it into at least 2, and then you could run it as 2 separate synths alongside each other. But I'm not seeing it. Obviously missing something, but that is part of that frustration of 2 to 3 actions to do one thing. They have been clever in their Unison and voices and editing being built into one little block that multi-purposes, but yeah, it just, I'm going to leave that there because they clevered themselves out of usability. So that's the big thing that to me undoes the instrument. All the good things about the instrument are unraveled to some extent. As to how far that is with you, that's between you and your God. But for me, it's enough to be like, oh, that's just annoying me. You're breaking my process. I'm here to make sounds, and you're here to make it hard for me to make sounds. It's like, why? But there is a way to layer multiple instruments. It is multitimbral in the one box. Not multitimbral in the full sense. I don't believe you can assign different MIDI channels to it, but I mean you can layer up to 8 instruments when you work out how to do it. Unnecessarily complex, unfortunately. Fair enough. Final words is that in terms of a sound engine, it's got its quirks, but it is very impressive, especially if you want to walk in and have that sound straight away. It can at times trap you in that sound, but there's nothing to stop you from moving past it, providing you understand what you're looking for and how to counteract that sound. I think that it is a lot in here as an instrument that it is very impressive. There is just that caveat and the full stop that I hit here that I could not realistically, and remember, not reading the manuals is part of the brief for this process of reviewing, and that's too complex. I worked it out and then it's unworked out. That to me is it is a flaw. And again, I will simply say, as to whether that's a fatal flaw for you, it is going to be sort of what matters to you, what other instruments you've got. Because I've got, well, in this case, Europa. I think this is a reasonable analog. You know, Europa and Dune, I think, are close enough to each other. Europa doesn't have that sound out of the box, but there's nothing to stop you from getting there, and even getting a nicer sound. You just got to do the work. Certain things are easier there, certain things are easier here. Europa does not have the ability to layer, but within its 3 oscillators, which are all the same as each other, and there isn't one of them being inferior, you can do a certain amount of layering already. So making one layered patch, just with one patch, is easier than here, partially because I'm more used to it. Its effects aren't as impressive as these, but again, they get the job done, and if you're in Reason, you've got access to the whole Reason rack. So that's a fair comparison in that sense. Between this and, say, Zebra, well, Zebra's set out to be able to do more things, but I think that when you know what the result you're looking for, the timbre that you're looking for, not saying I'm looking for an FM, this, that, and the other, when you're looking for, well, I'm after that kind of timbre, you work out how you get there with this, just as I do with Europa. You just work out how to get there, you're going to get the results. So that would come down to workflow. I think the wavetable-y thing, assuming the sample import works better than I have sort of discovered so far, this I think is a little bit more elegant. It's more newly created than that in Zebra. Hopefully Zebra 3, if and when it ever shows, will have some finesse to that part of their engine, because I think it's a little clunky now. So plenty to like about Dune. Just please try the demo. If you're just a preset hand, make sure that you can access the kind of presets that you're looking for. If you're going to dig in as a real sound designer, just get comfortable that those things that I find frustrating are not going to be a killer for you. But to get access to the sound, yeah, it's it does what it says it's going to do, and mostly does it pretty elegantly. Hope you have found value and some understanding in that. This one's turned out to be a little bit of a longer one, but it is a big instrument. If you have any questions, please not about Synapse, that goes to them. They have their support department for that. But any general questions about this, or just want to say some nice stuff, we like to hear nice stuff, please hit the old subscribify button and type it in below. We love to hear from people. It helps us to know that people are watching. We're more interested in engagement than we are in just blank numbers of plays. Engage. As I've said quite a few times in this situation, engaging with other people is where the magic happens. Part of the reason I was late last night was because after the show, I'm talking to people. I'm building relationships with those people. And it was great last night because people were actually open. They were like, wow, you've done a great job mixing this stuff. It sounds super, which is good. That's half the battle. And they were open to asking questions and hearing my answers, and to actually thinking. A couple of them were like, but that's not what everyone else says. Like, no, here's why. And they're like, oh. So that's the thing that happens when we engage, when we back and forth. I'm happy to see that happening here. So most important thing, try the instrument and make sure that you have a great day.